Welcome, I'm Professor Stan Johnson. The following presentation is for our class, Business Project Risk Management. This evening, we will be covering information provided in Chapter 13 of our text. The topic under discussion is preparations for probabilistic analysis. The specific objectives we will be addressing are as follows. 1. To define and explain probabilistic analysis. To list and discuss the main goals of probabilistic analysis. And then to define the method statement in probabilistic analysis and its components. And then we will next explain the high-level workflow in probabilistic analysis. The fifth thing that we will be doing is describing the anatomy of output distribution. And finally, explain how may the overall project cost and schedule uncertainty be addressed. There are four major goals for probabilistic cost and schedule analysis. The investigation of confidence levels of planned or sanctioned project budgets and completion dates. Number 2, the development cost and schedule reserves to ensure the required or comfortable confidence levels of total project cost and completion dates. Then the identification of the most sensitive general uncertainties and uncertain events for their further addressing, allocation of cost and schedule reserves against them, or optimization of baselines. Finally, number 4 is running an investigation of additional what-if scenarios to evaluate impacts of particular groups or uncertainties. Concerning number 4, it's important to run probabilistic kinds of models with and without particular groups of uncertainties. One must consider the major drivers of delays associated with the execution of the project. And one of those might be, say you had a government permit situation. There's a delay that could happen if you were able to grab all the group of all the impact there and determine what that impact is. Then it would inform you and help you to be making a decision in relationship to your project. So first, run these probabilistic models with and then without the particular groups of uncertainties, and then next compare the two results and analyze the differences. This will show what areas are affected by the group of uncertainties. A list of what-if scenarios should then be generated to determine the various other groups of uncertainties that the decision maker deems necessary. Now, a decision maker should come up with a list of what-if scenarios for the investigation. The next two charts will outline typical workflows to develop in running a schedule and a cost risk analysis. This one here that we're looking at is a workflow of schedule risk analysis. It shows the need for integration of deterministic and probabilistic methods, okay? Because this is finally bringing all that together. Notice at the top under Project Uncertainty Repository that it states frozen scope, cost, and schedule. This is done because a deadline must be made to no longer add additional information. It is clear that this may continue on, and the people would continue to add things to the project, and this kind of constant change, you would never get a solid baseline to be working from. So you're going to have to determine a final cutoff date where you're going to freeze that. And that way, from this baseline proxy schedule, we can then determine schedule and schedule general uncertainties, deterministic completion dates, and schedule the uncertain events. Durations, ranges, and impacts feed into, if you look here, it all feeds into the Monte Carlo simulation. And the output, of course, is the cost model. Okay, so that's where its output is going to. So here is an example of that schedule workflow chart for cost. Their major differences are in modeling of schedule driven cost, and after the cost model and Monte Carlo simulation, we can then determine cost distribution, we can determine confidence levels and sensitivity. All of that can be determined at this point. The modeling with correlations provides a realistic and logical analysis suitable to make an informed decision. When planning the Monte Carlo, any probabilistic analysis should be managed as a small charter project. You've got the schedule, the start, the finish, the milestones, and the interfaces with various disciplines and budget. So going to the slide, the method statement and schedule of analysis, it talks about just what I mentioned, and that it should be managed as a mini project. The method statement is a key document that outlines the scope, the schedule, resources, interfaces, and deliverables of the risk analysis. The method statement should reflect the interest of decision makers in particular what-if scenarios. So you're doing multiple what-if scenarios to determine how these groups are going to react and how they're going to affect the internal operations of your organization. The previous experience of project teams does impact. If they're very new to this, this needs to be taken into account when you're looking at your analysis. Something that's not mentioned here on this slide is the consideration of float time. This can often be mitigated, and this can often be a time frame where different uncertainties are mitigated, because it's sort of like dead time in here because they're floating prior to doing something else. And when you got that, you may find out that that's the time that you're doing the addressing activities and that are mitigating the uncertainties. And therefore, even though you had that happen, it doesn't impact on your project at all. And this can be a real opportunity that comes in your direction. Okay, the CSRA, which is the cost and schedule risk analysis, is an integrated standard in the industry, and it should be used at the end of select on. The cost part of the CSRA before the schedule input should be done as if the deterministic completion date were met to exclusion of double dipping. separate cost and schedule risk analysis could be used before the end of the select. One thing to know is if you have an EPC company, the high-level version should be used for each of the major project lump sum proposals. This chart shows the specifications of the CSRA, which is the cost schedule risk analysis inputs. This shows typical proxy schedules, different registers, branching, and then as you look there at the bottom, you can see it's got the what-if analysis there. Of special note in specifications of inputs to probabilistic models is they have different levels of detail. And the level of detail in the baseline should be comparable to the level of detail of uncertainty definitions kept in the project uncertainty repositories. If you don't do that statistically, it will be too narrow and you will get incorrect outcome. We didn't go through that because of the central theorem, which would have been much more it's called central limit theorem, which would have been much more complicated and unnecessary to achieve that end. So just remember that we need to have comparable levels of detail in order to get the kind of results. If you got something, they're both real detailed. Actually, the more detailed they are, they tend to be more narrow, and then therefore less accurate. The mapping, this chart shows a probabilistic schedule register. The mapping of an uncertain event to impacted normal activities is mandatory. The project must not impact detrimentally on the day-to-day operations of a company's productivity. This can be mitigated when correctly mapped and addressed. So, uncertain events do not make an impact on a project as a whole. They impact on specific normal activities. So I'm going to say that one more time. Uncertain events do not make an impact on a project as a whole, but they impact on specific normal events. In addition to that, if they impact on the critical path, then it will impact on the completion date of the project. Okay. This chart shows the probabilistic cost register. And you might want to note that mapping of an uncertain event to impacted cost accounts is not mandatory. Introduction of correlations is mandatory. The schedule-driven costs are excluded, and the reason there is it would be redundant. So some final comments on building and running Monte Carlo models. It is of primary importance to have validation of your final resulting documents. This can be achieved by thorough team reviews, and it is highly recommended to have third-party reviews. I strongly recommend PERT for many projects, and this is because it correlates impacts of certain events on several normal activities with a correlation coefficient of 90% by default. This is a very reasonable level of correlation. After viewing this presentation, each student must write a reflection paper on what they learned from Chapter 13. This paper should be sent as an attachment to Dr. Stan Johnson. My email is profstan@gmail.com. Please also put Chapter 13 makeup in the subject area. Thank you. Thanks for your polite attention, and this concludes today's presentation.